discoveries of the 20th century. The drug, penicillin, was to save millions of lives. It was the beginning of a revolution in the treatment of infectious disease. Its development, part of the Allied war effort, is thought by many to be as important in the outcome of the Second World War as the atomic bomb. But who should take the credit for penicillin?
It was Fleming's name and Fleming's picture, and fed in the newspapers. We thought at first this must somehow be a misprint for Florey, but it certainly was not.
A long-time controversy haunts this tale of a medical miracle. Tonight, Nova travels back in time to unravel the mystery behind the rise of a wonder drug. The triumph of penicillin made international to explain its strange and marvelous discovery.
This immense discovery on Mary's Hospital through this very window of mold blew in and set.
A mold is an enchanting story, but what really happened is even more dramatic. Romantic myths abound, but perhaps the... But if it had been left to Alexander Fleming alone, many who did the crucial work have been forgotten. Relation of a grateful was Fleming's story. The history of penicillin is fraught with conflict and controversy. Professor Gwyn McFarlane, a scientist and historian, set out to uncover the full contribution. McFarlane started with Fleming's initial discovery. Fleming kept his original culture plate, and it's now stored at the British Library. Unfortunately, between a big growth of green mold and yellow colonies of bacteria lay a no man's land of dead microbes. Something coming from the mold had killed them. That something turned out to be penicillin. According to McFarlane, observation, the potential of the mold shrouds Fleming's historic discovery. McFarlane contemplates Fleming's scientific reputation.
Fleming has been widely accepted as a great man and a great scientist. On a par as if Fleming or I really...
Fleming first became a bacteriologist in the same way he would discover penicillin, by accident.
Become a surgeon, but in the meantime he was anxious to get a temporary job at St. Mary's which would keep him in the rifle team because he was a very...
Arrangements were made and he joined the inoculation department in 1906, where he would remain for... It was well known that these germs caused disease, but more than quackery. Infections were commonplace and often lethal. They were as feared as cancer and heart disease are today.
I'm old enough to remember hospital wards absolutely full of patients. That an organ in the body could become a seat of an infection. And really, there was almost nothing that the doctors could do about it. For example, I remember very well patients which part of a rib would be removed and a tube would be put in, and the patient would sit in bed with pus draining tube into a large contain a pint or two of pus.
Ironically, while thousands died from pneumonia and TB, an effective treatment was found for the scourge of... After 605 attempts, the German chemist Ehrlich had made an cure. He sent some to Almroth Wright, on to Fleming.
Fleming was extremely neat and dexterous with his hands and could be intravenous injections without the material spilling out. As an improvement in the method, he soon had quite a wide practice.
Success earned him considerable recognition, and the nickname... It could have alerted him to the idea of treating infection by injecting chemicals into the bloodstream. Almroth Wright, his skepticism of such treatments grew. As First World War,
most battle casualties were infected when they were Streptococci and Staphylococci, but the very dreaded one was infection by the organ. This produced a spreading gangrene with terrifying rapidity, and unless a surgeon could amputate above this infection, the result was invariably fatal. Most army surgeons antiseptics to control the septic infections. Wright and Fleming soon found that these antiseptics actually did more harm than good.
The harsh antiseptics destroyed white blood cells and interfered with the natural healing process. They were nearly useless against infection. So Fleming's doubt agents which could fight infection without causing damage. But Fleming took up other interests when he returned to London, as Ronald Hare, then a researcher at St. Mary's, remembers.
It's a theory, and he was on one stick or something. He'd invent something to do with it.
People collect stamps or plants or example of strange bacteria used to colored pictures painted on a culture medium with brushes loaded with these bacteria, and as they developed and grew, they formed the most beautiful little pictures.
More sometimes pay off. Experiments on the fluids of his nose and eye discovery. Using a squirt of lemon juice, he collected his own tears. He found that they contained some ingredient which, to continue his experiments, he needed more. Once again, Fleming made news. The humor magazine Tear antiseptic. Elmroth Wright christened the new discovery lysozyme. Lysozyme did not kill disease-causing bacteria, but it did prepare penicillin.
One day, in the year 1928, he was examining some sepsis germs grown on jelly before sending them to be destroyed on mold.
Alexander, it isn't often that we have the privilege of meeting somebody who's made such an important...
Interviewed by the BBC, tried to explain.
A week afterwards, for salt was a mold.
Now, by contamination with a mold, do you mean the sort of thing that happens to a housewife if she leaves the top off her jam too long, that sort of thing? That's
exactly the same. Here's a good example. See, on the surface here, on top of the paper, there may be the same mold.
Molds are tiny organisms that reproduce by casting off spores into the air. One microscopic spore into a large produce penicillin. Rare strain of mold. The discovery was not as simple as it first appeared. Fleming always believed that the mold, but his window was almost impossible to afford on the that tiny mold spores drifted up the staircase for exotic strains were being collected for research on allergies. Even so, it has proved extremely difficult to reproduce the effect Fleming observed, because molds and bacteria each need bacteria on plates where they formed colonies. But on this occasion, some plates were left out in the cold on the bench, and one became contaminated with the mold. Fleming left to go on vacation, and the English usual cold bacteria started growing. Beneath the lid of an abandoned laboratory, killing off the young bacteria, and 3 weeks later, luckily, the imply above the liquid, only inches away from destruction. Fleming happened to look through the plates one last time to show an old friend what he'd been up to. Fleming noticed the extraordinary plate.
Discovery possible, form an almost incredibly... I think this very luck plays in many scientific discoveries, but this discovery of premium...
For Fleming down the stairs and come upstairs about 11 o'clock to get a cup of coffee. On this occasion, he had a culture plate in his hand and proceeded to show it to all of us. And nobody took the... Oh.
Despite the indifference of his colleagues, Fleming embarked on a series of... But the substance was... And he soon moved on to other projects.
Now, the really lost interest in penicillin. He did most of his penicillin containers. That...
What accurately reflects his research had mixed with blood, it lost most of it. Fleming thought of penicillin as a local to other labs on influenza. But his published paper did not attract much to the story of the reemergence of penicillin, but it depended on a different approach to science, just of in Australia.
I remember my father consulting the headmaster, and he said, "Oh no, you can't go outlet in Australia." And it was then that my thoughts turned to medicine.
As a ship's doctor, he worked his passage to England in 19...
One could sort of gaucheries as bar, just one of these rough colonials.
Florey was a rough, tough Australian, completely uncompromising, rather prickly, very energetic and tense to his work, this extraordinary dedication. He really could collect a team of people who became almost as dedicated and enthusiastic as himself.
I had a refugee German chemist named Chain, whom I got from Cambridge.
And I think he knew it. And he used to pace up and down a room while he was talking and hiss loudly before making some sort of extremely enthusiastic remark.
There is no art. The general principle is that you go out and you look for interesting new biological phenomena which you hope you will be able to explain in chemical terms.
Chain searched through over 200 scientific papers. Eventually, he chanced upon Fleming's report in a 10-year-old. They already had a sample of Fleming's mold in their culture store. Growing it in small flasks was simple.
The properties are most unpromising. It was described as so unstable that you lost it practically while you looked at it.
Not only was it notoriously part in 2 million with penicillin, too. The breakthrough came when Dr. Norman Heatley suggested that changing the solvent's acidity might free up the penicillin. Chain had been against the idea to argue with.
For example, he said, well, it could be. And his reply was, "But Heatley, I am telling you, it is yellow, yellow, yellow."
Even after Heatley's practice of impurity, in fact,
all
Britain was on the
birds congregating together are prohibited until further notice. Air raid warning.
Film of the lack of constant threat fitted to the penicillin work. Efforts to penicillin.
Leave your shelter until you hear signal.
By 1940,
I'll never forget, we did an absolutely crucial experiment. Would prevent the certain death of mice which had been experimentally infected with a deadly streptococcus, a kind of disease. Given a certainly fatal symptom, then 4 of them would...
Heatley kept a diary of the events.
After supper with some friends, I returned to the lab, 2 of the mice.
Heatley began his Saturday night vigil.
I stayed at the lab till 3:45, by which time animals were dead. It really began to grow like...
And after though the shape of the world may alter, in our tunes the laughter blends the tears.
Went to the lab at 11:45, did mice alive.
When the professor he expressed his feelings about the result of this experiment by saying it looks, and as he was usually a person he used meant that he was really excited about it.
Was to test penicillin in man, but a person is 3,000 times the size of a mouse.
Difficult. A university department really this had to be Florey's decision, and it was really this university department to change its character, particularly, and it led Florey into quite considerable trouble if the venture had not come off.
Grow best in shallow containers that have a large surface.
Thick, in a vacuum sterilized. We used all the laboratory containers that could be used, but the stuff enough, and these are used. But was the hospital bed pad. Cliff Infirmary let us have 16, which was all they had.
Heatley then found of 1940. They were finally able to grow gallons of moldy liquid. They'd be able to begin clinical trials. They were ready, and the 2 would be. Their first was toxic to humans. Soon found a terminally ill woman who agreed to be their test subject. The substance was injected in feed safe for human use. Had been fraught with danger, as Dr. Edward Abraham.
In most cases, really was very fortunate indeed that among this massive impurity that there was no such.
Finally, the case of a young policeman.
Bad ill, he'd had a sore in his mouth, an infection had spread over his scalp, he had abscesses there, it had spread to both, moved, he had abscesses being cut open on it, and we'd nothing to lose and everything to get. Penicillin was such that after his urine, I took it in a bottle of big stain on the third day. When I got over there, it was absolutely delightful, because Florey was a very taciturn man, a very accent. It was excitable. That's marvelous, isn't it? And the day I did that. On the third day, he was the first day, and on the fourth day, he really was dramatically. Because, of course, when they extracted from back, and there just wasn't enough to go on. And he wasn't cured, he gradually relapsed.
One, an incurable infection behind the eye called...
It was a condition that I'd always dreaded as a medical student, and I'd never actually seen a case, but his eyes infusion was vastly improved, and after a week, he was sitting up in bed and playing with his toys. I mean, it was unheard of. But at the sad end, carotid runs through the part. Afternoon, it suddenly broke, and he had a hemorrhage in the brain and died suddenly.
Clinical trials to support the Oxford team's conviction of their patients.
The wounded were embarked and brought home under the protection of the...
Florey realized that using wounded soldiers measures to protect...
As Eddington Hill in the Panzers, and a bit of the fungus and smeared it in the... If anyone had escaped.
The clinical trials, the Oxford team needed outside help to grow and purify more penicillin. But the bombing of London severely wartime Lisbon.
There was no black eye, 5 or 6 spoonfuls and so on.
It's a very good reason, because you had the clear...
They boarded the Clipper for New York.
Each has been luxurious seats, lovely carpets and upholstery.
Of mold, having crossed the Atlantic in the Clipper fridge, would now have to brave. Dr. He Florey was up to the challenge.
I think he was a very good wanted to do was to persuade about a kit we were using.
But before they began their work, Florey had an important visit to make in Connecticut. His 2 children, Charles and
Fulton had invited them, and I think prepared to believe Florey. They were astonished.
Optimistic Florey's ambition.
We were shunted first of all to Dr. Tom, who was the sort of eminent biology.
Intrigued by the therapeutic gigantic remote lab in the Midwest.
Oh, this was a little different from when you...
When they arrived in 1941, they were met who took them back to his lab. A growing mold penicillin process, Coghill.
We started working with put him on the penicillin project.
What Heatley used.
At Oxford, extract, boiled extract. And when Moyer learned of this, because about rotten corn steep.
Corn steep is a byproduct. After the kernels are softened. The liquor produced for growing moors is
corn steep liquor around the lab, and so it was natural to use it.
After their persistence paid off.
Was doing.
Tact and diplomacy to get along with Moyer.
Known to be strongly anti-British. I'd been away on a trip. I said, how are you getting on? What year? 20 units. How'd you do that? That's splendid. And he said, oh, well, I...
was surprised got patents on the corn-steep medium without consulting Heatley or sharing in the profit.
That not very patent royalties on a British discovery. I had a patent that was a single signature, but I refused to license a particular patent for someplace else.
Corn-steep medium was an important step forward, but it was still not enough. In Peoria, Florey went back on the road. His quest for a kilo of penicillin would take him to any scientist interested. Richards became a convert and powerful head of a government committee on medical research and drug companies. The drug company produced in mass any profit in it. Too was at war. Casualties. From this point on, penicillin production would become a matter. Determined to see penicillin succeed, Richards organized a meeting that he knew would galvanize the drug company.
That was a great surprise to the industrial people, and George Merck immediately got to his feet.
But thousands of kilos for the American.
Penicillin has been compared to the Manhattan. It was really decided. Sent of the atomic bomb.
A historic partnership had been forged, yet the drug companies had to struggle against their competitive instincts.
Dr. Richards, but because of the antitrust law, that was there were a few arrangements made, but I think there was very information every.
And I don't to give any. They had to survive. There was a feeling of excitement throughout everything that was going on, and that did pervade everything we were doing. There's no question about it.
Delivery of his kilo.
Parcel from Merck's, quite a big one, and that was unwrapped. That was this, but I think I can imagine some of them.
The American government was strictly controlling the release of the limited supply of penicillin. From hospital, remember
42 from Dr. Fulton, a rather important person in the year, and there was any penicillin.
Fulton's influence, Merck got permission to send the drug to her doctors. She became the first American to be
whatever
speaking at 106 degrees. The question facing her doctors was what dose.
I'm not clinically qualified, of course, and so I told him I'm quite sure he would say, don't decrease the dose. And for a week or two, I had quite recovered.
Patients were clamoring for military trials. The disastrous Coconut Grove fire in Boston later in 1942. Nearly hundreds were by penicillin worked. Discoverer, Alexander Fleming, was attaining the status of international hero, much to the chagrin of those like McFarlane.
In 1942, when we opened our newspapers, for the development of penicillin in Oxford, it was Fleming's name and Fleming's picture, and Fleming's name in head was some.
Fleming had asked Florey for some penicillin to treat a dying friend. Fleming gave dozens of instant credit.
The newspaper campaign was, in fact, kept. There was St. Mary's Hospital for contributions. The second thing was that Almoth Wright wanted to be school and St. Mary's Hospital, and very generous. Categorically, he felt it his duty to see that the credit did go to Fleming. And
several British penicillin.
That it may need the product of 100 flasks to cure a present output only meets the priority calls from the fighting front.
Florey traveled to North Ireland to give the... His radical suggestions would track casualties. He took this case. He suggested tubes, almost certainly have lost his leg. The problem was still. Meanwhile, in the U.S., operating. Even so, it was an inefficient. Had to find
Submerged production, which produced to meet the demands of the military and
their heels.
When Dr. us of the volume of liquid, it was a very inefficient way of producing penicillin because it took such a Merck decide for production is used and so it goes in the top. Sorry to blow it.
At one point, the War Production Board said,
burning mold since the summer of '41 with the help of Army Transport Command. Soil samples were flown in from all over the world.
And to see if they belonged to the group that Penicillium notatum chrysogenum belonged to. Reading them, bring in moldy materials. We came across mold on a cantaloupe.
They had
this off, and having checked it and found it was as good for, we began to try to improve it.
From this mold, new, even higher and gave up. The intensive wartime effort, which had quickly led to the triumphs of corn-steep mixed mold, of penicillin. 1,000 Allied soldiers wounded during the invasion of Normandy, D-Day.
What has impressed me most, Fleming was a brilliant observer. Without the Fleming method to change, this will probably
continue for medicine. The effort. Penicillin's story is a striking tale of luck,